most sincerely hope becomes the premier podcast for Pauper. You can call me Frucile. I am going to do my best to standardize that name across all platforms. At this time, I'm a lot of things in a lot of places still. You may have seen me be 12 Jammy Dodgers on Reddit, or perhaps you've seen me as All Slivers Have Sadness on a couple other platforms. I also have Blackest Lotus on the lockdown on places like Instagram. So I'm going to do my best to just be frucile everywhere for purposes of this podcast. Now I want to take a few minutes here to introduce the purpose, right? The philosophy of this podcast. First and foremost, this is episode 0. This is a prelude. This is the prologue to the actual podcast. The reason why it's episode 0 is because this podcast is limited edition. I will be doing exactly 100 of these, not counting this one, right? There's going to be episodes 1 through 100 following a different format than what I'm doing right now. This is just an introduction. Now, I intend to be recording on Sunday, immediately following the challenge, and publishing Fridays. Eventually, I'm going to start publishing Wednesdays once I have the hang of this, once I feel I can ensure quality on a Wednesday instead of a Friday. I'm going to start putting them out on Wednesdays after the first 10 or so. Now, this podcast is about competitive Pauper, right? It's going to be about conversations. It's going to be a lot more journalistic than the traditional podcast. The traditional podcast is usually friends talking, right? It's a conversation that takes place. This is going to be more of an interview. I'm going to interview Pauper's best players right after they finish tournaments. I'm going to ask them about their tournaments, what they played, why they played it. Hey, you have a really interesting card in your sideboard. What's that for? Did it work out for you today? Things like that. I want the competitive Pauper players to be able to stand on top of my platform, right? I want to build a platform because platforms support weight, but I'm not going to stand on top of the platform myself. This isn't about me. Now, some of you recognize the screen name Frucile. Some of you may even recognize this voice, and for those that do, I'm gonna repeat myself. This isn't about me. That may come as a surprise to the people that knew me in the past, as well. I'm a narcissist, and I've definitely had a huge ego my entire life. But this isn't about that. This isn't about me sharing my opinions. This isn't about me speaking my mind. This is about the competitive Pauper community finding its voice. I don't want to speak for them, right? I want them to speak with me so that the larger audience can hear them. Right now, there's a lot of people talking in Pauper, and Wizards is listening now that we're a real format, right? It's like that scene in Pinocchio where he's like, "I'm a real boy." Well, that's us right now. You know, we're a real format. So I want to pick the brains of some of the best players, right? And fresh. I want fresh thoughts right after tournaments. Now, that's exactly why this is episode 0. I'm not willing to waste an episode talking about myself or introduce myself on a guest's time, because this podcast is about my guests. So episode 0 is going to be a little bit about me. Again, that's sort of the philosophy behind this podcast. The competitive Pauper community is mainly speaking amongst themselves, to themselves, which makes it difficult for Wizards and the general Magic audience to hear the discussions that we're having. So I wish to create an outlet for the competitive Pauper community to be heard. Now, I am going to ask every single guest a little bit about themselves before I ask them about their tournaments, about their card selection choices. And I'm going to take this time to introduce myself. So, again, my name is Frucile. That is not an Italian or French word, although I do get that a lot. It is an anagram for Lucifer, because I made my MTGO account when I was 17, and I'm pretty sure that I had just finished the Satanic Bible. More importantly, I had just started reading Paradise Lost, and Lucifer is a very interesting character in Paradise Lost, you know? Right from the get-go, right from the first chapter, where he's talking about how it's better to rule in hell than it is to serve in heaven, and how the mind can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. It was just a case of, I was 17 and I thought I was deep because the devil comes in disguise, and frucile is, it's an anagram. So that's the explanation behind that screen name. It was good enough for me on MTGO for the last 15 years, and it was good enough back in the Full Tilt poker days to be my screen name there when I was an Iron Man on that platform roughly a lifetime ago. I started playing Magic when Legions came out. Again, I was in high school. Now, as far as competitive Magic goes, well, at age 19, I was a very depressed person. I struggled with anxiety, and I was suicidal for some time. Taking Magic from casual to competitive was a distraction for me at that time. It was my coping mechanism. And so I started traveling to tournaments. I started focusing on that because it was a beautiful distraction from the problems of my real life. And, those aren't things that concern me anymore. I most certainly do not have depression. I most certainly do not struggle with anxiety. I have not been suicidal for a very long time now. But that's sort of how the transition happened from me being a kitchen table player to me being a competitive player, is that I just needed a distraction. And that became my outlet to do that. Now, I did have a little bit of success in the competitive scene. Nothing really too noteworthy. I've been to the Pro Tour. I've been to U.S. Nationals. I finished just outside the money. At U.S. Nationals, they paid the top 32, and I think I finished 35th the year that I went. I have a handful of Grand Prix Day 2s, but again, nothing really too exciting. What's important, though, is that immediately following the Pro Tour, I lost my love for the game. Pretty much completely. I don't like drafting. I don't want to get better at it. I don't enjoy it. I don't want to draft. Unless, of course, it's Vintage Cube. Vintage Cube is delicious, and I will draft that. I wish there was a career where I could just, draft Vintage Cube the rest of my life. I would do that every single day. I'd just wake up in Vintage Cube. But that aside, I do not enjoy drafting. And the fact that Pro Tours, or whatever the hell they call them these days, have draft integrated into the championship. You have to play draft whether you like it or not. Really put a real damper on my spirits, because I did just fine in the constructed portion, but limited just doesn't do it for me. Which is important to note, because at this time I'm qualified for the Format Championship, which will take place in January in 2020. I'm not intending to win. I'll let you know right now, I intend to concede to someone in that event, because I don't want first place. First place goes to whatever they call the Pro Tour these days. I think it's a Mythic Championship. I don't want to play that. It could not be less interesting to me. I don't want to go halfway across the world to play two formats I'm not going to enjoy, because God knows it's not going to be Pauper when I get there. I really love Pauper. And I want to tell you just a little bit about how I came to love Pauper, right? To bring this back. After the Pro Tour, I stopped playing Magic. I focused on online poker because that was a thing then, and I wound up dropping out of grad school to pursue online poker because I was pretty decent at it. However, that did become illegal in the United States about 6 months after I made that decision. I had a day where I lost my job and most of my assets in the world were frozen by the US government. Having all the free time in the world, but no resources, I borrowed some of my roommate's disc golf discs and went disc golfing for the second or third time, and I fell in love with that game too. Just like I've fallen in love with Pauper at this time. That would be my passion for the next 7 years. I would learn a lot about community and community building in that time period, and being part of leagues, eventually being the president of a league, coordinating with the parks department to make sure the course was maintained, running fundraisers to improve the course for the players, and just doing general things to grow the sport, right? Giving discs to small children, seeing people out there that were clearly out there their first time and just playing with them and helping them learn the basics, inviting up-and-comers to come join us at League, making sure that I connected with people who wanted to improve their game, and seeing, if I could connect them with people that would be a good match to help them improve their game. So community became very important to me during that time period, and that's why this podcast is not about me. This is why it's about the community. Now, two years ago, in the spring of 2017, I damaged my shoulder. It got shredded. It wasn't good. I couldn't use my right arm, which is my dominant arm, for, let's call it 3 months. I could not open a door. I could not hold a phone to my ear. I couldn't drink from a cup. Everything that you use your dominant arm for on a daily basis, I could not do. So disc golfing became impossible. After about 2 months of just hiding from the world, because I didn't want anyone to see the one-armed man, I wandered into Friday Night Magic, and I borrowed a deck. And I read every single card that I had in my deck, and I had to read every single one of my opponent's cards. But you know what? I could use my left arm the entire time without needing to use my right arm. I had to pile shuffle every single time, which I understand isn't exactly allowable at a higher competitive level, but everyone there understood, right? They all got it. And that's how I got back into Magic. After a 7-year break, Pauper didn't come immediately. I thought I would get back into Modern once I started playing Magic again. I knew a lot of the cards, but it didn't really click. I also thought I might get back into Vintage. At one point, I was only a Vintage player. I was a format specialist with that for a while. So I took about $30 and I put it on MTGO, and I bought 3 different Pauper decks with that money, figuring that I could grind Pauper into Modern or Vintage, which I did. But then I wound up not playing Modern or Vintage because Pauper won me over. I fell in love with Pauper. It has so much nostalgia for me. There are no planeswalkers, which I absolutely love that there are no planeswalkers. Pauper is a lot more akin to Magic as I knew it during my formative years. And it has some of my favorite cards of all time, like Brainstorm, like Counterspell, like Preordain. Even though Preordain is admittedly a new one for me, it's a lovely card, and I quite enjoy casting it. So that's how I got into Pauper, as I sort of stuck with it. It really has won me over. And because of my other life experiences, I've learned the importance of community, which is exactly why this podcast is not about me. Now, I do need to say that I have selfish intents. I have selfish motivations with this podcast, is that I want to get better at interviewing people for let's call it career purposes. I don't want the attention that most content creators get. I want no attention, actually. I want to live a quiet life. I simply want to get better at interviewing people, be able to demonstrate competency of social media, again, career related. And finally, I want to create a platform for other people to stand on top of. That way their voices can be heard. Especially because, again, there are a lot of people talking, and Wizards is listening. But the people who play the most Pauper, who play the most competitive Pauper, the people who create the decks that many players simply copy and take to tournaments. Let's hear those voices. Let's let those voices speak, and let's give them a space for them to talk about what they actually like to talk about, the competitive aspects of this game. Things like card selection, things like sideboard choices, things like matchups. Now, I'm gonna keep this initial one short because I don't really want to talk anymore about myself. I've talked more than I would like to about myself. I want to talk a little bit about what I have coming up with this podcast. The structure is going to be pretty standardized. I'm going to introduce the guest. I'm going to ask them how they started playing Magic. I'm going to ask them how they got into Pauper, and I'm going to ask them why they stuck around with Pauper, which, as you notice, I've just done with myself as to introduce myself. So those same things, I'm gonna get a little bit of a feel for my guests, and then I'm gonna ask them about how their tournament went, because I'm gonna be interviewing people right after the challenge. For the first few weeks, I do have guests lined up. I'm gonna let you know right now we have some heavy hitters coming on the podcast to get things started. I'm not gonna drop any names. I'm gonna let you guys be pleasantly surprised. But in the future, once the ball gets rolling, once everyone knows what this is about, I'm going to simply be reaching out to people who did well in the challenge immediately after the challenge finishes. So we're going to have, to close out the session with a guest, 2 different things. We're going to have a play of the day, where I ask the guest about the sweetest thing that happened to them in the tournament, whether it was against them or whether or not they were the one doing the sweet thing. I'm also going to share my own play of the day every time that I played the same event. And the last recurring weekly segment will be give Slivers a hilarious ability. Again, I am all Slivers have sadness on several platforms, because if one sliver has something, then all slivers have it. So it takes one sad sliver, right? And then they're all crying. They're all having a bad time. If one sliver goes through a rough breakup, then I guess every sliver feels that same shame. So those will be the ending for the podcast each week. The recurring weekly segments, play of the day, and give Slivers a funny ability. I hope you join me on Fridays for what I most sincerely hope becomes the premier podcast for Pauper. Thank you so very much for your time. I'm going to be coming back at you. I have guests lined up for September 1st and September 8th